The rain had been falling over the city since noon, the kind of steady autumn rain that soaks through wool and settles into your bones. By the time evening came, the streets outside Bellamy's steakhouse were slick and dark, reflecting the gold light spilling from its windows like something out of an old postcard. Inside, crystal glasses caught the candlelight. Waiters moved between white tablecloths with the quiet confidence of people who had done this 1,000 times. It was the kind of restaurant where reservations were made weeks in advance, where a bottle of wine cost more than most people's weekly groceries, and where nobody, not once in its 30-year history, had ever seen a man walk in looking the way Walter Higgins looked that night. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, letting the rain drip from his coat onto the polished floor. His beard was gray and unkempt, tangled with the kind of neglect that comes from weeks, maybe months, without a proper razor. His coat was patched in places, torn in others, the kind of coat you might find discarded behind a laundromat. His boots left wet, muddy prints with every step. Nobody in that restaurant knew that the man standing in their doorway was worth $11 billion. Walter didn't tell people that anymore. Not for a long time now. It had started as an experiment, 3 years back, after his wife Eleanor passed and the house grew too quiet and the board meetings grew too hollow. He wanted to see the world the way ordinary people saw it. Not the world of private planes and corner offices, but the world of bus stops and closed doors and eyes that slid past you like you weren't even there. He found that most places, the eyes did slide past him. Some places, they didn't just slide past. They hardened. He walked toward an empty table near the window, and that's when Richard Cole, the restaurant's manager, appeared like a shadow crossing a doorway. "Sir," Richard said, and his voice had the particular chill of a man protecting something he considered sacred. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Walter looked at him. He had been asked to leave a great many places over the past 3 years. He had grown almost fond of the moment right before, the small window where a person still had the chance to surprise him. "I have money," Walter said quietly. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a few worn, wrinkled bills. It wasn't a lie. He always carried real cash on these outings, never cards, never anything that could give him away. "I'd like a table, please. And a steak, if I could." Richard's jaw tightened. Around them, heads had begun to turn. A woman in a beige coat pulled her purse a little closer to her chest. A man in a navy suit uncrossed his arms and then crossed them again, watching with the particular discomfort of someone who wanted to seem unbothered and was failing. "This isn't that kind of establishment," Richard said, lower now, trying to keep his voice from carrying. "There's a shelter on 5th Street that serves dinner until 8. It was in that moment, with the whole dining room holding its breath, that a young waitress stepped between them. Her name was Margaret Doyle, though everyone who knew her called her Peggy, a nickname her grandmother had given her when she was small, and it had simply stuck, the way good nicknames do. She was 26 years old, with light brown hair pulled back in a simple knot, and the kind of face that seemed built for kindness, open and unguarded in a way the world hadn't yet managed to close off. "I've got this table, Richard," she said. Richard looked at her the way a man looks at an employee who is about to make his evening very difficult. "Peggy." "I've got it," she said again, gently, but with a firmness that surprised even her. Richard hesitated. There were other guests watching now, phones half raised, and a scene was the last thing the restaurant needed. He gave a tight nod and walked away, but not before fixing her with a look that said this conversation wasn't finished. Peggy turned to Walter, and her expression softened into something that had nothing to do with policy or performance. It was simply warmth, the kind you don't learn from customer service training, the kind that comes from somewhere deeper. "Right this way," she said, and led him to the table by the window, the good one, the one usually reserved for regulars who tipped well and never complained. Walter sat down slowly, the way a man sits when his knees have grown tired from years of walking and his heart has grown tired from years of being looked past. He glanced up at her. "Thank you," he said. "You didn't have to do that." "Everybody's got to eat," Peggy said simply, setting a glass of water in front of him with the same care she might have given anyone else. "What'll you have?" "The ribeye," Walter said. "Medium. And whatever potato you'd recommend." She smiled. "The garlic mashed. Trust me." As she walked away, Walter watched her go, and something inside his chest, something that had gone quiet a long time ago, gave a small, unfamiliar stir. Peggy had grown up in a small house 2 counties over, in a town where the biggest excitement of the week was the Friday night football game and the diner on Main Street that had been serving the same meatloaf special since 1974. Her father, Harold Doyle, had worked at the auto plant for 22 years before it closed down, and after that, things had gotten hard in a way that Peggy, even now, tried not to think about too closely. There had been a winter, when she was 14, when her father lost his footing in a way that wasn't about ice on the sidewalk. He'd lost his job, then his pride, then, for a stretch of nearly 4 months, his sense of who he was. He didn't become homeless, not quite, but he came close enough that Peggy understood, in her bones, what it felt like to watch someone you loved get treated as less than human simply because their circumstances had changed. She remembered a night at that same diner on Main Street, when her father had gone in for coffee, just coffee, because that was all the money in his pocket could buy, and a waitress named Dot had brought him a full plate of eggs and toast without being asked, and told him it was a mistake in the kitchen, free of charge, please don't let it go to waste. It wasn't a mistake. Peggy's father knew it wasn't a mistake. But Dot had given him a way to accept kindness without losing what was left of his dignity, and Peggy had never forgotten it. She had promised herself, somewhere around that time, that if she ever had the chance to be the person holding the plate, she would be exactly like Dot. Tonight, watching the old, weathered man by the window eating his steak slowly, savoring each bite the way people do when a good meal has become rare in their life, Peggy felt that old promise rise up in her chest. The dining room, however, had not forgotten him either. Whispers moved between tables like a draft under a door. A woman 2 tables over murmured something to her husband, who glanced back at Walter with open discomfort. Somewhere near the bar, a young couple stopped mid-conversation just to stare. Richard Cole watched all of it from across the room, his arms crossed, his patience fraying with every passing minute. This was not how Bellamy's steakhouse operated. This was not how any of the fine establishments he had worked in for the last 15 years operated. There were rules, unspoken ones, about who belonged in a room like this, and the man at table 12 broke every one of them. When Walter finished his meal, Richard approached the table himself, carrying the check like it was a verdict rather than a bill. "That'll be $64, he said, his tone clipped. Walter reached again into his coat and counted out the bills slowly, his fingers stiff from the cold outside. He came up short. Not by much. $4, maybe $5. It was a small gap, the kind of gap that in Walter's other life, his real life, would never have mattered at all. But tonight, in this coat, at this table, it mattered enormously. "I can wash dishes," Walter said quietly, looking up at Richard. "If that would settle it." A few nearby guests turned their heads again. Richard's face reddened, embarrassment and irritation tangled together into something sharp. "Sir, I think it's time." "I've got it," Peggy said, appearing again, the way she had at the beginning of the evening, stepping into the space between 2 people before it could turn into something ugly. She reached into her apron pocket, pulled out a small folded slip of paper, and set it gently on the table beside the bill. Then, without another word, she walked away toward the kitchen, leaving both men staring after her. Walter unfolded the paper with hands that, 3 years ago, had signed contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and had not trembled once. Tonight, they trembled. The note read, in handwriting that slanted gently to the right, the handwriting of someone who had learned cursive properly, the old way, in a schoolroom with a chalkboard. "You remind me of my dad. He was down on his luck once too, and a kind woman gave him a meal without making him feel small for needing it. I'm paying the difference out of my tips tonight, and I don't want you to think twice about it." Everybody needs somebody in their corner sometimes. Tonight, I'm yours. Enjoy the rest of your evening, sir. You deserve to be treated well. Peggy. Walter read it once. Then he read it again, slower. He had been given many things in his life. Awards. Honorary degrees. A key to a city he could no longer remember the name of. None of them had ever made him feel the way that small, folded note made him feel, sitting there in a torn coat with rain still drying in his beard. He looked toward the kitchen doors, but Peggy had already disappeared behind them. Richard, for his part, had gone quiet. Whatever he'd been about to say died somewhere in his throat when he saw the note pass between them. He picked up the bill, saw that it had, indeed, been settled, and walked away without another word, though something in his expression had shifted, just slightly, like a window cracked open to let in air that hadn't been there before. Walter sat alone at the table for a while longer, the rain still tapping gently against the glass beside him. He thought about Eleanor, about the early years of their marriage when they had nothing but a small apartment and each other, before any of the money came, before any of the doors in the world opened for him simply because of a name on a business card. He thought about how easy it was to forget, when the doors keep opening, what it felt like when they didn't. He thought about his own father, a man who had worked the docks in a different city, in a different decade, who had come home some nights with nothing in his pockets but the same tired dignity that Walter had seen tonight in his own reflection in the restaurant window. Slowly, he stood, folded the note, and placed it carefully in his coat pocket, the way you might place something fragile that you intend to keep for a very long time. He came back the next evening. And the evening after that. Each time, he sat at the same table by the window, and each time, Peggy served him with the same unwavering warmth, never once asking why he kept coming back, never once treating him as though his presence needed an explanation. They talked, over those visits, about small things. About the weather. About a book she was reading, second-hand, its cover creased from being carried in her bag. About her father, Harold, who had eventually found his way back to steady work, driving a delivery route now, content in a quieter kind of life. About her grandmother, who had raised her on Sunday dinners and the belief that everybody, no matter how far down on their luck, deserved to be looked at like they mattered. Walter never told her who he really was. Not for 3 full weeks. It wasn't dishonesty, not really. It was something closer to reluctance. He had grown so used to people changing the moment they learned his name, their eyes shifting from warmth to calculation, that he wanted, just this once, to hold on to something that hadn't been touched by it. But eventually, the truth has a way of finding daylight. It happened on a Thursday evening, quiet, the restaurant only half full. Peggy was clearing his plate when an older gentleman in an expensive suit approached the table, flanked by 2 younger men in equally expensive suits, and addressed Walter with unmistakable deference. "Mr. Higgins," the man said. "Your car is outside. And I apologize for the intrusion, but the board meeting has been moved up. They need you in New York by morning." Peggy froze, the plate still in her hands. Walter closed his eyes for a moment, the way a man does when a private thing has become public before he was ready. Then he opened them, looked up at Peggy, and said gently, "I should have told you sooner. I'm sorry." Higgins, Peggy repeated softly, and something clicked into place in her mind, a name from newspapers, from television specials about self-made fortunes, a name she had never once connected to the quiet, gray-bearded man who ordered the ribeye, medium, with garlic mashed potatoes. "I'm not proud of the deception," Walter said. "I only wanted to see the world honestly for a little while. You gave me something I hadn't felt in a very long time, Peggy. You gave me kindness without knowing there was anything to gain from it. Do you understand how rare that is?" Peggy sat down slowly in the chair across from him, the plate forgotten on the table. "I didn't do it because I thought you were somebody," she said. "I did it because you were somebody. Just, you know. A person. Cold, and tired, and hungry, same as anybody." "I know," Walter said. That's exactly why it mattered. He didn't offer her money that night, not directly, not in the way you might expect from a story like this one. He knew, somehow, that it would cheapen what had happened between them, would turn a genuine act of grace into a transaction, and he had learned enough about Peggy in 3 weeks of quiet dinners to know that a transaction was the last thing she wanted or needed. Instead, he asked about her life. Really asked, the way people rarely do. He learned that she had once dreamed of going to nursing school, before the bills at home had made that dream feel impossible, before she had taken the job at Bellamy's simply to help keep the lights on for her mother, who had grown ill the same year her father lost his job at the plant. He learned that she still kept a worn nursing school brochure in the drawer of her nightstand, years old now, its corners soft from handling. A few weeks later, Peggy received a letter in the mail. Not from a lawyer, not from a foundation with a complicated name and a stack of paperwork. From Walter himself, in his own handwriting, slanted and old-fashioned in its own way, not so different from hers. Inside was an offer. Full tuition to the nursing program of her choosing, along with a small monthly stipend so she wouldn't have to work double shifts to make ends meet while she studied. Not charity, the letter said. An investment. In someone who had already proven, without being asked, exactly the kind of person she was. She cried reading it, sitting on the edge of her bed in the small apartment she shared with her mother, the brochure from the drawer open in her lap for the first time in 2 years. Peggy did go to nursing school. It took her 3 years, evenings and weekends around a lighter work schedule, but she graduated near the top of her class, and on the day of her graduation, sitting quietly near the back of the auditorium, was an older man in a very fine suit, his beard neatly trimmed now, applauding louder than anyone else in the room. She went on to work in a hospital not far from where she grew up, in the same kind of town where her father had once lost his footing and found it again. She had a particular gift, the nurses there would say, for patients who came in scared and alone, the ones nobody else quite knew how to comfort. She would sit with them. Really sit, the way she had once sat with a stranger in a torn coat, and let them know, without needing to say the words outright, that they mattered. Walter never forgot the debt he felt he owed her, though Peggy would always insist there wasn't one. He funded a small scholarship in her name at the nursing school, quietly, without his name attached to it, for students who, like her, needed a hand up rather than a handout. And every year, on the anniversary of that rainy night at Bellamy's, Walter would find his way to whatever hospital Peggy was working at, and the two of them would sit together for an hour over coffee, an old man and a woman who had once slipped him a folded note when the whole world seemed to be looking the other way. There's an old saying, one that Peggy's grandmother used to repeat at Sunday dinners, back when the world moved slower and people still sat on porches in the evening just to talk. She used to say that you never really know who's sitting across from you. Not really. Not the whole of them. And so the safest thing, the kindest thing, the only thing worth doing, is to treat every person like they might be carrying something heavier than what you can see. Walter Higgins had $11 billion the night he walked into that restaurant, and not one of those dollars had done a single thing to ease the particular ache of being looked past, of being seen as less than human because of a torn coat and a tired face. What eased it, in the end, was a folded piece of paper and a young woman who had learned, from her own father's hardest season, that dignity is a gift you can give someone even when you have very little else to offer. Peggy never thought of herself as someone who changed a billionaire's life. To her, she had simply done what her grandmother taught her, what the diner waitress had taught her own father decades before. She had looked at a stranger and decided, in the space of a single moment, to see him. That is, in the end, the whole of the story. Not the money. Not the nursing degree, though that mattered too, more than she ever could have imagined. It was the simple, quiet decision, made by a tired young waitress on a rainy Thursday night, to treat a stranger like he still belonged in the room. And maybe that's the real lesson in all of this, for anyone listening tonight who remembers what it was like when the world moved a little slower, when a plate of eggs could be handed across a counter without a word needing to be said. Kindness doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it comes folded up small, tucked beside a bill, asking for nothing in return.